Good afternoon, and welcome to the first NFHS media availability session. We are glad that all of you were able to join us today. My name is Bruce Howard. I'm Director of Communications and Publications with the National Federation of State High School Associations, and we're pleased to have all of you here today. We will be hearing from Dr. Karissa Niehoff, the Executive Director of the NFHS. Just now completing her second year after 8 years as head of the Connecticut Association of Schools and the Connecticut Interscholastic Athletic Conference. This session will be recorded and it will be available upon request, and you are permitted as well to record and for any live streaming windows that you wish. And while Dr. Niehoff begins the conference today with several of the key issues going on, you can go ahead and put any questions that you have in the Q&A, and she will be responding to those questions, as many as possible, as soon as she finishes with her opening remarks. The main topics that we are here today that she's here today to talk about is the status of return to sports and activities for high schools nationwide, as many of those state associations and schools across the country are beginning to make plans to figure out when they can open up schools and open up high school sports and activities nationwide. And from our perspective, the need for those students to be able to return to activity programs for mental and emotional wellness. And then finally, a great aerosol study that we've been a part of, and that shows some hope for being able to conduct activities. The National Federation of State High School Associations last year, as a matter of fact, celebrated its centennial after having been formed in 1920. So we are now closing in on completing our 101st year as a national leader and advocate for high school athletics and performing arts programs. We serve 51 state associations, 19,500 high schools, and 12 million student participants across the country. Over the course of those 100 years, writing playing rules for 17 sports for boys and girls has been certainly one of our key tasks that we've been involved with. And lately, we've been able to become a great educational source through online education courses for high school coaches, officials, parents, students, and others, to ensure that all students have that opportunity to enjoy healthy participation, achievement, and good sportsmanship. Today, in addition to myself, we have Chris Boone, Assistant Director of our Publications and Communications Department. Chris will be directing your questions later to Dr. Niehoff. And also Cody Porter, our Manager of Media Relations, and Nate Perry, our Coordinator of Media Relations, will be involved in monitoring our Q&A and getting those questions answered for you. Along here today also with us is Dr. James Weaver, our Director of Performing Arts and Sports, who's been integrally involved in the aerosol study and will be helping out provide information in that regard. So at this time, I want to turn it over to the Executive Director of the NFHS, Dr. Karissa Niehoff.
Thank you, Bruce, and I want to welcome everyone from the media. Hope you and your families are well. And before we get into our conversation, I just want to offer a thanks on behalf of the NFHS staff and the Federation family at large. We truly appreciate all you do in your profession, and we really thank you for taking the time today to join us. As Bruce said, we know you probably have a lot of questions about what's happening around the country. We will do our very best to operate the chat room and the Q&A function to answer your questions today. If we do not get to your question, please know at the end of the presentation, you'll see a slide with some contact information for our office. We are happy to communicate with you at any time. If you have your own programs, podcasts, whatever format you're working in, we are more than happy to engage with you and your audience. And again, we really thank you for what you do. We're going to talk about four major things today. First being the current state of decision-making for state high school associations around the country. We are in regular communication with our executive directors and commissioners. And at the state level, our state associations have to be in communication with the governor's offices, the state education agencies, and state health agencies as they make decisions. So as we communicate with executive directors, we're seeing a number of models emerge around the country. Some states are maintaining a schedule that they want to return to activity as planned in the fall, although there might be a delay in preseason. Some state associations are actually modifying the start dates for sports, and others have actually flipped seasons altogether. So in this graphic, you'll see the 2021 sports calendar modifications. As of this morning, you'll see a modified calendar in the dark blue states. You'll see no changes in the gray states. And then we thought it would be important to indicate which states have made explicit decisions around football changes, where they're actually not even having fall football at this time. We will just tell you, as you well know, this map is changing on a day-to-day basis. Most of our state associations between July 1 and the end of the month are engaged in meetings with their governors, with their boards of directors to make those decisions about scheduling. Tomorrow afternoon, we have another roundtable discussion with our states. We are hearing that the majority of states will see likely a hybrid model of returning to school. So we'll have one portion of students that might be in a school building for a couple of days, for a certain time of the school day. There might be a day in the middle of the week somewhere for cleaning. We might see another portion of students coming to school at the end of the week. We're also hearing about models that have students who are fairly successful in some subjects actually engaging in online learning for the subjects in which they require less remediation, whereas if they require more remediation, they might be coming into the building for online learning. So those are some of the hybrids that we're seeing, and I think the intent is to actually get all kids back to some form of online learning, in-person learning. Of course, that means if they're back onto campus, they're likely going to engage in return to activity. The guidelines that the NFHS released months ago provided some support for how to get kids back and engaged in activity. Our guidelines came from our Sports Medicine Advisory Committee and took an approach through a phase-in process. It also looked at staging of sports or tiering of sports in terms of perceived risk regarding contact and possible spread of respiration. And some of those higher risk sports included football, wrestling, even a couple of our field sports where kids are in close proximity. We had moderately risk sports in the middle, and then certainly lower risk sports such as golf, individual sports like tennis, and things like that. So our guidelines and our guidance for return approached sports from a risk perspective. Schools and state associations considered that guidance for return and are using that to some degree to make their own decisions in their states. Again, they're working with their governor's office, they're working with their state education agencies and the state health agencies to make those decisions. And we're seeing that even within states, depending on population density, depending on the numbers of COVID-19 contagion and hospitalization, we need to be looking at trends in a staged process to make decisions. So it's very likely that within a state itself, you'll see some school districts that are back to activity, other school districts that are not, and even some school districts that are delaying sports seasons altogether. A couple of models that we're seeing emerge involve a January to June approach for all seasons of sport. In some states, we're seeing a 2-season approach, and in some states, we're actually seeing an abbreviated 3-season approach. So you're looking at far fewer contests into a state tournament option before we switch to the next season and finally the next. So we're actually looking at states that will continue co-curricular interscholastic activity beyond the scheduled end of the school year. So as we watch these decisions emerge, we're going to see a patchwork across the country. One of the things that's very consistent is that states across the country want kids to be back. We want kids to be participating in activities for a number of reasons. There's a lot of energy right now around what we're seeing at the youth level, in club sports and recreational opportunities, as well as at the collegiate level, where very powerful Division I leagues, the Ivy League and smaller D1 leagues have actually decided to cancel their fall seasons. The NFHS and our member state associations want to be clear in our messaging that we are different. And we are different because we are education-based. And by that, we're looking at not just to focus on athletics and activities, but also at getting kids back to school. There's research coming out of Wisconsin where over 3,000 student athletes were researched and reported over 3 times greater incidence of depression, likely linked to not being able to engage in school and in their co-curricular programs. We want to make sure that in our education-based environment, we're paying attention not just to COVID, but also to the emotional and mental wellness of our students, looking at why our students need to engage in those activities. There's a wealth of research about the impact of participation in co-curricular programming on actual perseverance in school, in learning those life skills unique to those co-curricular programs, and how those life skills carry on through further study, through pursuing careers. And there's a lot of research about folks who are leading business organizations saying a lot of the leadership skills that they learned are directly tied to their participations in high school sport and activity. So we are very much supportive of kids coming back, assuming that there are the safeguards in place. Obviously, the attention to the situation at the local level and the guidelines from their education organizations and health agencies. But the high school experience is different from youth sport, and it is different from the collegiate level. So we wanted to be sure that part of our message today and dialogue with each of you has to do with the reason why we may be promoting a different position, if you will, from some other organizations. We believe kids need to return, of course, in the safest manner possible. The third area of conversation that we would like to share with each of you is something that is unique to the NFHS and its collaboration with universities in terms of research. So we are actively engaged right now in a research initiative with the University of Colorado Boulder and the University of Maryland. Our partner in this research is the College Band Directors National Association. We have more than 125 organizations that have formed a coalition to commission an aerosol study. And this commission has actually funded this study. We are in our second month of what will be a 6-month study. We are looking at volume, direction, density, emission rates, and the model of dispersion of aerosols with and without mitigation strategies, without masks, with plexiglass shields, things like that that we are seeing now to mitigate some aerosol spread. The researchers right now, after an initial round of research, the researchers are recommending masking students, masking instruments, reducing rehearsal time, and adding HEPA filters or rehearsing outdoors. Some of the subjects of the research, being youth through adults, are not just looking at instrument playing, but looking at speaking with a louder voice, as in a theater performance, And actually what we will be also looking at is aerobic exertion after coming off of a treadmill, to look at how respiratory exertion and respiration spreads, so that we can get a better idea of the distance and volume of potential respiratory droplets and aerosol spray. We are excited, as no one to our knowledge is doing the similar kinds of research or looking at research and returning to the classroom environment itself. So we are really hopeful that this research, the results of the research, which we hope will be released the second round in late July or early to mid-August, will be able to be shared nationwide to better inform some of the decisions made at the state level. The final area of conversation today we want to share with you that we're also very excited about is through our NFHS network. The NFHS network has committed to offering free Pixelot cameras. These are these self-automated cameras that can be installed in gymnasiums or on fields, usually in a press box. And we are offering 2 free Pixelot cameras to all 19,500 high schools in the membership of the 51 state associations. The network has allocated more than $200 million in capital to do this. And this is underway as we speak. We've had over 40 webinars scheduled for our individual state associations. The NFHS network staff will be installing these units for a cost of $2,500 to states, or the schools themselves can install the units for free. So that we hope our schools out there across the nation can be capturing content, not just athletics, but performing arts activities, school plays, wherever the venue is installed. We hope that all of this content can be uploaded to the network to be shared with families, friends, and associates internationally who may not be able to attend in real time. So we're extremely excited about this initiative as well. So those are the 4 main areas that we wanted to bring to your attention today. We are happy to, I'm going to do my best here to get into the chat and see what kinds of questions we have. I know our staff who are also on the call are doing their best to answer your questions as well.
Yeah, I'll be happy to start getting those questions to you, Karissa, and make it easy. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We'll get to as many of them as possible. First off, from Eric Sondheimer, who asked, how realistic is it to believe high school sports can resume this season without testing for athletes and staff?
That's a great question. And I think we need to be clear what type of testing when we talk about testing. We're seeing our schools and our co-curricular programs look at a thermometer, a non-contact temperature check, and you've probably seen those devices to monitor temperature. Obviously, we know that a lot of our COVID-19 carriers may be asymptomatic. I think what we will see as we phase into school and activity is some form of on-site testing with regard to temperature check. We'll see our students as they're in classrooms wearing masks, and we'll see social distancing in the classroom, maybe even using outdoor facilities and gymnasiums as those classrooms. If kids are back on campus, we will likely see a phase in, certainly to sports like cross country, golf, tennis. In some states, those individual sports are in the fall. Other states, they're in the spring. Full contact, closely contact sports like football, I think we will see a delay. Is it likely that we will be playing football as we've previously scheduled it to be, without testing, without mitigation? I don't know. Each individual state will be making those decisions. I think, quite frankly, we are in a pattern of delay for the higher risk sports like football, whereas other sports will engage in more traditional competition earlier. Many of our states, as you'll see in gray, Iowa, as you know, they're already playing baseball and softball, entering into championships. and they have a plan in place. They are actually seeing schools that have had to quarantine. I think that's what we will be seeing. I don't think it's realistic to expect that we will not see testing that reveals a positive case. It's our hope that if there are positive cases, the actual symptoms that develop are mild for our young people. But we certainly are seeing state associations developing action plans for how to isolate and ultimately quarantine any positive tests. I think we will see a phased-in approach, closely aligned with whether or not kids will be back in classrooms. Tomorrow afternoon, we have another roundtable with executive directors. We will be discussing strategies for actually implementing sport if, in fact, kids are not back into classrooms. Probably talking about outdoor sports, if they're not, in fact, with one another in an indoor setting. We're greatly concerned about the cancellation we're already seeing about marching bands. So we're watching our performing arts opportunities as well. Is it likely? I think it's likely. We'll go back, but it'll be phased in. And is it likely we might see positive cases? Yes. But as we mentioned early on, we have to be paying attention to the well-being of our kids from a learning perspective and the impact that engagement in co-curricular programs has on their growth and development, and in fact on their learning. Kids, there's research, kids learn better when they are engaged in co-curricular programs. So we want to see a comprehensive consideration as we make those decisions.
Very good. Another question here, and you kind of touched on this earlier, Karissa. When our state associations are making those decisions to modify their calendars, what organizations, what other feedback, how are they making those decisions? What goes into those decisions, and who's helping them with those decisions?
Sure. So obviously the governors in our states, they're making decisions that impact economic involvement and engagement, and of course schools. State departments of education making the decision about school phase-in general. We are seeing individual school districts making their own decisions, apart or in front of governors' decisions. And they, of course, have the authority to do that. For public education in particular, local control has been historic. So local boards of education, superintendents of schools are taking into account their own level of resourcing. So if we are facing serious fiscal challenges at the state or local school level, so that appropriate testing to support appropriate safeguards getting kids back can't be done, some of those situations are informing decisions. Busing for your urban areas. If we can't get the appropriate amount of transportation, feeding kids in the most appropriate and safest environments. If we can't do those things, school superintendents are saying we're not ready to go back in person. We're also seeing the situation where we've got parents that need to go back to work. And if kids can work in an online environment, that's informing situations. If the online environment is there, but parents can't be home, we're seeing some of that conflicting energy emerge. So a lot of the local situation and local research, local decisions by parents influencing schools, superintendents influencing schools, it's state, it's local, regionally, and it's local within a district. So a lot of different decision makers are a part of the conversation.
Another question here, how concerned are state associations about the prospect of not being able to play football this fall, given its financial importance? And is this a concern for the long-term health of high school sports?
State associations are very concerned. When we surveyed our states before the end of the calendar school year, we heard from our state associations that just with the loss of winter and spring championships, we were seeing a 100 to 150,000 all the way up to excess of $2 million loss to state association revenues. If there are no fall championships, and we'll say football, state associations, some of them will be in pretty dire straits financially and absolutely having to dip into reserves to fund championships going forward, at least for a year. This is not a one-year problem. If there are no fall championships and no fall sports for our schools and districts, there are revenue impacts there that go far beyond this one calendar year. So we are very concerned from a financial perspective, but we're also concerned from a community perspective. And we're advocating at a federal level for any bill that would support back funding education itself, not just focusing on supporting funding for youth sports, but really looking at funding for the school districts out of which comes co-curricular activities for schools.
Very good. Another question here. Non-school sports, summer baseball and travel sports are all occurring this summer. How is fall sports different than all those activities that consist of high school athletes?
Yeah, great question. Youth sports, and I'm not saying this to cast any shade on decisions that are made by youth sport organizations, but I think we've seen for 2 months now, youth sports, youth soccer, youth baseball, youth volleyball, these programs have gotten back to kind of full swing activity, even with tournaments taking place with 40 teams, 70 teams, 80 teams, multiple states. I'll be honest and say that from the NFHS perspective, we felt that was fast. Our Sports Med Advisory Committee advised us again to do a phased-in approach that's very informed and very cautious, and involved a lot of education for all stakeholders involved. We also find that with education-based environments, there's a little bit more control over contact tracing and education of those folks that are working with kids, as well as maintenance of facilities through school district staffing and funding. So the first difference I would call attention to is in the school district programming, you have a lot of process and protocol about how things happen and who the people are that take care of our schools, teach our kids, coach our kids, and certainly communicate with parents. Those processes are much more developed in the scholastic space than they are in the youth or recreational program space in general. I'm not saying that there are club programs or rec programs that are not closely aligned with national governing bodies, because quite honestly, our national governing bodies that implement youth sports actually do sanctioning. They can tell you who their top performers in club programming are. They can also tell you who the true third-party club programs are. And no one has control over those kinds of programs in consistency nationwide. So there are a number of differences. First, from an education-based environment or ecosystem, then to the NGV-sanctioned youth and club programs, and then finally to the true third-party programs that really are driven by revenue and are heavily focused on competition as opposed to development of the whole athlete, the whole child, and of course, the developmental approach to the game. So a number of differences there.
Thank you. Is the NFHS recommending any liability waivers to schools or state organizations to hold events?
We are not, out of our office, recommending any kinds of waivers. We do not function as an oversight organization in terms of accountability or authority. So again, as I mentioned earlier, school districts are governed by LEAs, public school districts, certainly state education agencies, and they make decisions that are more oversight decisions than us. We do provide guidance. Our guidance really is heavily emphasized on education, on sharing information with stakeholders, parents, kids, school personnel. And we do know that schools require pre-participation physicals. Many of our schools do education sessions for parents and kids. And some of those decisions, we are absolutely seeing that schools are asking for waivers. Certainly sanctioned events that are across state lines, many of them are asking for waivers. Our state association executive directors and commissioners are asking to share with one another what waivers they are seeing emerge in their own states. So we recommend education, information, and caution. But we also recommend that we get kids back.
Thank you. Another question here relating to fans. What are your thoughts on having fans at events?
So again, some of these decisions are going to be made based on the dynamics and the situations that exist at local levels. We would like to see fans in the stands. Our state associations and schools are doing a great job already planning for that. What is the strategy to implement some social distancing in terms of seats in the bleachers, whether or not there are concession stands that are open? If there are concession stands, are we using appropriate safeguards like masks and gloves? And what kinds of foods and beverages are we selling? Are there X's on the pavement where people stand? So all of the things that we're experiencing when we go to a grocery store or we go to an event, those are similar things that our schools are considering as they get people back into the stands. We also know that the virtual environment is going to be hugely important, so that if schools are not back, in terms of bringing fans into gymnasiums to watch volleyball or onto field sidelines themselves, is there a way that we can capture these events and actually broadcast them? So the Pix-A-Lot initiative that I shared earlier is hugely important for schools if fans are not able to come back into gymnasiums or onto fields. But we support an effort, if you're bringing kids back to competition, to find a way to allow fans to come back. If you have the staffing and the strategies in place to bring folks back into the arenas and the venues so they can enjoy the events as well.
Thank you. What was your reaction to the recent Wisconsin study you referenced? I mean, how concerned are you for the athletes' mental and emotional well-being if fall sports are canceled?
Oh, very concerned. Very concerned. I think the Wisconsin study is a microcosm of the national scene for kids. When I was a teacher, a coach, an AD, and a principal, and taught health and wellness, the most important thing we need to pay attention to regarding our kids, especially in the scholastic age group, is how they're doing. How are they feeling? How are they developing? And key to kids, especially at the high school level, are relationships and developing their identity, developing their skill sets, developing their capacity for tolerating challenge and overcoming adversity, developing leadership skills, communication skills, teamwork. All of these concepts are almost cliche when we talk about what business leaders and people that are hiring people in the workplace, what are they looking for? It's probably no secret. They look at resumes and look for, did this young person participate in a sport? Did this person participate in band or do something else to develop another talent? We are most concerned that kids in that study self-reported an increase in anxiety, an increase in depression, an increase in the thoughts of suicide, an increase in the feelings of apathy, of disconnect, and definitely wanting to get back to connecting with one another. And the co-curricular environment is absolutely the environment that allows them to develop their skills and talents, to socialize, to engage with a team, to engage in an activity that they can develop their own skill within a larger environment. And it's different from academics. So that's why the co-curricular program really is the second half of the school day and very important for kids. We know that kids will tell us the co-curricular experience engages them in school. They come to school, they apply themselves to do well in school so that they can participate after school. A lot of kids report that. So all of those things that we see in the research and now we see emerging in the Wisconsin study are top on our radar and really is what's driving our message about the need to get back. Do it safely, do it appropriately, but we've got to reconnect with our kids.
Very good. Here's a question on officials. How do officials play into this? And do you expect to see official shortages in the fall? And are there any special protocols that they should take?
Fantastic question. So the NFHS released some considerations for adaptations to rules in playing sports, not hugely impactful to how the game is played, but for example, in volleyball, do you actually switch benches at some point in the match? That's an easy one to overcome when you talk about social distancing. We also released some considerations for officials regarding the use of electronic whistles as opposed to handheld. The preseason meetings and social distancing there, actually looking and touching equipment and things like that. So officials were also provided some things that they can consider to encourage them to feel a little more comfortable about going back. That being said, are we anticipating a further shortage? Yes. In some sports, the average age of an official is upwards of 50 years old. We know there will be officials that are concerned about going back, especially in areas where the COVID-19 numbers are still concerning and not on the decline. We don't, at this moment, have a sense as to what those numbers are. We don't really know until we get back into competition, but certainly as that happens, we will be able to report to each of you what we're seeing out there. Another kind of heat map that maybe we can provide. So yes, we are very concerned. There's already a shortage in many sports. So we want to do our best to allow officials to feel a little more comfortable with some considerations for how they might change their usual protocols.
Thank you. Another question here, when you meet with state association leaders, what are your observations on how they're meeting these challenges? Do you see an angst, a tenacity, a commitment? What are you seeing from them?
Yes, to all of it. There's an angst. There's an anxiety, and it's not about finances. We have weekly webinars with our state executive directors and commissioners. Nobody yet has talked about money. Nobody. What everyone has talked about repeatedly is how to be creative in getting kids back, to getting collaboration and consensus around being able to bring kids back statewide and what that looks like even within a state that's different. And how, if it's different, can we still have kids proceed through a season to potentially a championship? So that if, for example, if a baseball team in Iowa has a positive case and they have to quarantine, well, is that a forfeit? No, it's just not a game on the schedule. They couldn't help that. So our state associations are looking at ways to talk with schools, to talk with athletic directors, to talk with coaches and officials, to best educate everybody and bring everybody to the table to say, all right, how can we bring some common sense to this commitment that we have? What might this look like? Where can we bend? What can we bring? What can we do to fill in these gaps? At the same time, what is our Sports Med Advisory Committee saying in our state? And what is our governor saying? What is our health agency saying? But our commissioners and executive directors are not saying, I'm out at all. They are not saying, I want to pull the plug. They want to go forward. And if it means we wait until January and we condense our seasons, we're going to do it. If it means we flip football to the spring, fall sports to the spring, which Virginia just did, we want to make sure that we support our schools in a way that we can still play.
Very good. There are some state associations that have chosen to say that if one sport doesn't go, they all don't go. And some have done mix and match of that. Would you see this as a sound approach to getting students back to activities, or what do you see as the best approach?
I think the best approach is to take activities one by one. Some activities, as I mentioned earlier, are much lower risk in terms of distance between participants, potential aerosol spread, and we can look at all the options out there and say, yeah, we know which ones those are. Golf player is at much less risk than a football player. Those are the two extremes. I think we can bring activities back sooner that are lower risk. And maybe that's an approach to take that might be considered best practice. I don't think that it's because one can't go back on time, all shouldn't, unless of course kids physically aren't even in the building at all for some reason. I think there could be a way, if kids are not engaged in in-person learning, that there might be a way to engage in co-curricular activity that's outside, not in a building. I'm not a medical expert. I don't know specific risk and can't be quoted on that, but I think we will start to see information and research emerge that talks about the difference between indoor and outdoor with some quantitative data. Part of our aerosol study will be able to be applied to that notion. I don't think a one-size-fits-all approach is necessarily best practice. I think we can do this being thoughtful about one activity at a time.
Thank you. Another question, talking about the tremendous pressure to provide in-person instruction in schools while also placing student health as a priority. A lot of those teachers are also coaches. Do you know if a lot of the coaches who are also teachers are willing to resume in-person operations this fall?
Well, I'll tell you based on just what we're hearing, and it's anecdotal at this point from a national perspective, but still nationally, we are hearing that our coaches have tried to stay engaged with kids virtually while the COVID restrictions have been in place and people have been at home. So coaches have been in touch with their teams, trying to keep their captains motivated, keep the kids motivated, to do some X's and O's, to do some fitness and conditioning plans in the virtual space. We know our coaches want to come back. Are there coaches out there that could be anxious about coming back to participation? Sure. I think we're talking about people, and depending on where they are, again, there's a range of readiness that we have to be respectful of. But the general feeling that we're hearing about is that coaches want to come back. I think for teachers, and of course we're hearing this nationally, for teachers who are engaged in classrooms, different sizes of student bodies in their classrooms, especially in densely populated areas where you could have over 25 to 30 kids in a classroom setting. There's greater concern there. That's understandable. Different age groups of teachers are concerned, of course. So teacher unions are advocating for attention to be paid to some of those concerns and options for teachers. Tougher to be a coach or a performing arts leader and do it all virtually with kids, simply by the nature of the activities. But we are hearing from our music directors, our theater directors, speech and debate, and of course our sport coaches, we want to come back.
Absolutely. A couple questions on here related to the specifics of testing and protocols, medical protocols, which we don't want to get too much into, but can you talk a little bit about the NFHS, our recommendations to states? Have we provided any in terms of what states or schools should do in terms of the testing and so forth? Sure.
So our guidelines or guidance document talks about some form of on-location screening capacity, where states have resources, if they have the appropriate medical professionals on site that can implement thorough COVID testing, folks have the resources to do it. That might be appropriate for them. If they have only resources to do, again, a non-contact temperature check, that might be the way to do it. Certainly questionnaires. Part of the pre-participation physical, looking at any pre-existing conditions that might be related to cardiopulmonary concerns, any flu-like or COVID-like symptoms that are currently being experienced or experienced in the past. Have they been around people that have tested positive? A lot of what schools can do now on site is really through question and answer. And then saying, we've got a concern here, a little bit of a red flag, we've got to develop this further. We have provided guidance about on-site testing and having a plan in place so that if there is a positive screening, what to do about immediately isolating that person, any of those other folks in that small group of kids, that equipment, all of that, cleansing the facilities and the equipment, and then using the staging process to come back to activity. We don't require testing. We wouldn't recommend, because certainly what we recommend is taken with a pretty heavy consideration. We've not gone as far as to say we recommend the nasal swabs, but we do recommend that there be a process for being able to screen kids on site through the schools.
Thank you. How much is the NFHS monitoring the professional or college level on how they're handling the pandemic?
Yeah, I appreciate that question too, very closely. We are in contact with our NCAA colleagues at least once a week. I personally am in communication with commissioners of Division I leagues, large and small. Certainly, you know, the NCAA as an association has a different level of authority and oversight in certain areas of collegiate sport business. We also know that the conferences have some degree of their own generated oversight and decision-making. And of course, we saw the Ivy League fairly early in the decision-making at the collegiate level say, we're going with no fall sports. We're starting to see smaller D1 leagues in a delay process. And we're waiting for the Power Five. You know, the word that we're hearing from the NCAA colleagues is that it's hard for the national office to make a national kind of recommendation or decision before the Power Five has come out with their own information, because we've already seen individual conferences make their own decisions. So it's a little bit of a kind of a breathing operation here. Our conferences making decisions, is the NCAA recommending something that's a broad sweep, one size fits all, which is very hard to do in the NCAA ranks when you have D1, 2, 3, different sizes, different university presidents and leaders, and you know, so it's almost a kind of a one-by-one decision for the collegiate community, but we're watching them. Our messaging is that we are not the NCAA. We appreciate what the NCAA is doing, but the NFHS community is education-based, and our population of student participants, we're in it for different reasons. Many of the same reasons, but also many of reasons which are truly different age group.
Very good. Do you believe it's feasible for activities to return without any in-person schooling?
Yeah, again, I sort of touched on this a little bit. I'll say personally, I believe that it's feasible. But, you know, again, the philosophy of a school district regarding the connection between the academic half of the day and the co-curricular half of the day, I certainly appreciate that. If there's a concern about an optic, that one might be more important than another, or there's a concern there that might be a local concern, absolutely respect it, appreciate it. I was a high school principal, I get it. But I also think that in places where we can responsibly provide resources to get kids engaged in something that has to do with the life of the school, the life of the team, the life of the activity and the mentorship of the coach, all of the things that those experiences do. I think it's absolutely feasible to implement those kinds of programs without in-person learning, because likely there's online learning that's going on. So they are engaged in something that's academic. The facilities would just need to be safe, and the approach to being present would have to be appropriate.
Good. Does the NFHS have any guidelines or tips for coaches if fall sports do happen?
I would say education, education, education. And that means not just informational about COVID, but it's education in terms of interaction with parents and interaction with kids. Really, really understanding the degree, to a degree that's appropriate, how your kids and families are feeling about coming back, and what's the mood in the school, and what does everything look like, to every detail about the scholastic process, the guidelines that are in place, the safety precautions in place, and of course, getting your hands on every bit of information that you can about best practices in returning to full activity, phasing in, really following those recommendations. We know that there are states where kids have gone back to preseason, they've gone back together. We've seen it in youth sports. I hope that as those things happen, the parents, the student participants, everybody involved, all stakeholders are as informed as they can be and as respectful as they can be about that range of readiness. And working collaboratively, again, with schools, with other schools in your league, through coaching education opportunities, and certainly with your medical community.
Very good. That kind of lends into this next question a little bit. There's several questions on here about how state associations, how we help state associations. Could you talk a little bit about how the NFHS works with state associations on a state-by-state basis, and how the decision-making is ultimately done?
That's a great question. Great question. So we absolutely want to work with every one of the state associations, one-on-one or as a collective family. The guidance that we put out for our states regarding return to activity, the cleaning for musical equipment, cleaning for technology equipment for that matter, rules considerations, every one of those actual documents is Word format. So we say to our state associations, here, this comes from credible sports medicine research, those experts, whatever it is, do with this what you will. And they can take our information, use it, modify it, adapt it as they need to work best for their own association. We are also in touch with them, as I mentioned, constantly. So if our state membership says, you know what, NFHS, we really could use an opinion from the national office on something. We really want you to be out in front of us, to be a leader on something, to advocate for us. We will do that. If an individual state has a certain concern, if it's a legislative concern, we have filed many, many amicus briefs for litigation. We've filed many letters to help states in their communications with legislators. We've actually gone to states to participate in legislative hearings. And certainly from an education perspective, we are continuing to expand our online learning opportunities, be they webinars that we capture, be they full courses. We're approaching 80 different courses right now based on what states say they need. As much as we can provide that's free to states, free to kids, we want to do that. We really want to be the go-to for our schools and our state associations regarding anything that they need to keep their business going and most relevant.
Very good. Another question here, you've mentioned the CDC guidelines on preventative measures that superintendents in most communities intend to follow before resuming in-person instruction. Shouldn't those same precautions be promoted to school activities and sports as well?
Absolutely, they should. And in fact, the CDC guidelines were one of the significant resources that our Sports Med Advisory Committee used as they developed their guidance documents. We will absolutely publicly, day in and day out, say, please respect the CDC guidelines. We trust the expertise that's there, that has been there for a long time. And we rely on CDC guidelines to inform our own language that we share with states. So absolutely, and I appreciate personally that the CDC is advocating for kids to re-engage in learning, to re-engage in school to some degree that's appropriate. and to re-engage in activity.
Just a couple more here as we get close to 3 o'clock. You spoke about a number of states that have moved back the start of their sports seasons to January and holding shortened seasons, with a lot of experts saying that winter months might be worse in terms of coronavirus. Would it be better to play low-risk sports in the fall instead of moving everything back and opening up the possibility of having to cancel again?
Yeah, we've had some states actually consider that, saying, you know, as we go back, let's do golf, cross country, swimming and diving, tennis. Let's run those guys in the fall. And then in the middle, whatever timeline that is, the middle season, be some of your moderately risked sports, such as your field sports, baseball, softball, might even be soccer and lacrosse, depending on what definition we're using in terms of risk or exposure. And then do your highest risk sports like wrestling, football. You know, I think we might consider basketball. We hear two different opinions on basketball, if that's a higher risk doing that in the final season. So some states are actually looking at that. Now, in the next few days, a lot of our gray states on that map are going to be making decisions. So what is gray is not what is definite right now. We know that what is blue is what is definite right now today, but even overnight that could be changing. So we will keep, and help me out, Chris, is the link to this resource already being shared with our folks on the call?
I believe so, yeah. It should be in the chat.
Pay attention to that chat. I haven't looked myself, but I believe that was our intent to put it there. This is a live, we monitor the situation and change this on a daily basis. So keep that link there for yourselves. And certainly then states are doing press releases as they make their decisions. You know, if we can keep up with them and their press releases, you know, that's our goal. So tomorrow this might look different.
Yeah, it probably will. We'll just do one more here. How closely did we monitor the baseball and softball seasons in Iowa, and how did we feel that went?
So we monitored that I think the whole nation did. And I don't know if there's a hard stop on 3 o'clock from the host perspective, but you know, if technology-wise we're not at a hard stop, I'm happy to stay on if there are just a few more questions. I don't know what that situation is, Chris, but we definitely want to make sure we capture your questions. If we don't get to them, you know, please, we'll capture those and post something that provides answers. But we watched Iowa very closely. As soon as they made the decision that they were going to continue, I reached out to both the girls and boys executive directors, and I got back a very thorough description of the processes and procedures that they have put into place, as well as clear communications with their schools, that this is optional. And a great majority of their schools did opt in. A handful did not. The handful happened to be in the more densely populated areas. But as they are majority or more rural, the schools opted to go ahead and try to play. As we mentioned earlier, a few did have COVID positive tests. Those kids and those schools were quarantined for 2 weeks, and they actually are just starting their tournaments for baseball first and then softball. So Iowa has managed to go ahead and implement 2 successful sports seasons with strategies in place to deal with COVID. We have not gotten information that any serious illnesses had occurred, and we have not heard that there have been any spread of COVID with respect to being a part of a sport situation. In fact, just last week we heard that we had no reports that there was any contact tracing incidents with regard to baseball or softball in Iowa.
Very good. Well, yeah, we can keep going if you're good to go. There's a few more questions here we can get to.
Drive on.
All right. All right. Would you encourage some states to just delay the start of fall sports in hopes that in most of the areas we'll be in better shape in a month or so?
Yeah, I'll answer this personally, and I would answer with an NFHS hat on as well. I mean, I watch the news in the morning. and I watch the maps, and we listen to those statistics and the concerns and look at the numbers. I think it, depending on when a normal start time is, I would encourage real consideration about what's going on in your particular state, and especially in your counties and your regions, with regard to the rate of the positivity. So of all the tests that are being administered, it's great if test numbers go up. It's what we want to look at is the positivity percentage. So here in Indianapolis, we're looking at about, I believe it was 8.9% positivity last time I looked, essentially 1 in 10. That's a concern. So if you're looking at 1 in 10 versus 1 in 100, I think we really need to consider whether or not we have the appropriate procedures in place to bring kids back. And if it means we have to watch those numbers for another 2 weeks to look for a plateau or hopefully a decline in positivity, personally, that's what I would say we need to look at before we think, we're just going to try to go back on time. We'll try this thing. Don't want to be non-mindful of what those numbers are looking like in your area.
Very good. One of the issues that, excuse me, that this brings up is the issue of transfer eligibility in a lot of states. How should state associations handle those, such as transfers from a school district not opening in the fall to one that is, or move-ins from out of state?
And if we just run out of time. All right, so our states, this is something we're talking about. You have some states, I'll use Kentucky as an example. I believe Kentucky borders, was it 10 or 12 other states land-wise? I mean, Cody, you're from Kentucky, you'll give me that. But we have some states that are, landlocked and contiguous to a number of states. And we're hearing that there are families that are telling their schools and state associations, if there are no sports this fall, they're moving. We're going to go over somewhere else. I can still commute to work, but I'm just moving. And that's a legal transfer when people move. It's hard to deal with that when there's a legitimate change of address in most states. And the school, that's a hard thing to fight. If student athletes do not change address and try to transfer schools, what's really important is that the transfer is not made for athletic purposes. And that generally falls onto the shoulders of the principals to say, I support the transfer. There was an issue here at the school. We couldn't service the needs, what have you. I support the transfer to another school. But sometimes we find that dynamic between parochial or private and public schools. Most states have public to public transfer eyeballs on why those kids are moving. I don't necessarily support that states relax transfer rules simply because the home school district is trying to keep people safe and trying to keep kids safe. I think that's, a little bit short-sighted because that to me clearly indicates that parents are trying to put sport, over their learning environment here. If where they're coming from is not a safe area to go to school, who knows if they're asymptomatic and they're bringing the environment from where they live to another district. We don't know. So I think for a lot of reasons, I would be cautious if I were a state association looking at relaxing transfer rules. And then you think too, if a student athlete comes from another district and we recognize it's pretty much a relaxed transfer rule, and are they going to unseat another person on the team who's a legitimate resident and a legitimate student athlete or participant in the school? There's some of those other peripheral things to consider too that are dynamics relative to transfer. So, but all that being said, we know state association decisions are often member-driven decisions. So member schools may in fact, through their boards of control and boards of directors, vote to approve some of those transfer rule changes. So I lock elbows with our state association offices, our brethren there. We appreciate how decisions are made in states. So guidance and perspective, my thoughts, but fully appreciating how states are governed.
Thank you. It's an interesting question regarding athletes. What are your thoughts on the idea of letting athletes decide on whether they should play fall sports and including them on that decision-making process?
Well, certainly if athletes want to play fall sports in schools, they should have the opportunity before them to do that. I think what happens, and this is colloquial maybe, but I think in a lot of households, the kids often can persuade parents enough to let them do things like play a certain sport or do a certain activity. And parents say, well, okay, we'll let you try that. We'll let you do that. Interesting research by the Aspen Institute recently. Parents of youth programming were surveyed about their readiness to let their kids return. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but you can Google it. But when parents were surveyed individually, they expressed a higher degree of concern about return. And then when you look at the numbers of kids that are actually back, the two statistics don't align. So I think what may be at work here is a dynamic at the youth level. Again, we haven't done research at the high school level, but there might be a dynamic that kids are so anxious to go back. Parents really are this concerned about it, but in the end, they say, if I trust my coaches, trust my facilities directors, I'm gonna let them go. So I don't think the athlete should be the sole decision maker. If the school opportunity is there and the parent says, we're ready, that's probably the healthiest way to get the kid back. But who knows? Who knows? Who knows what happens at the dinner table?
Exactly. Could you share a little more information? We had a question about the risk factors for the different activities and how those were put in those tiers.
Sure. Our Sports Med Advisory Committee, through the guidance document months ago, did present 3 tiers of risk. And their descriptions were based on looking at CDC guidelines, USOPC language around tier of risk. And one of the major differences was basketball, where we placed basketball in the highest degree, the 3rd tier, with regard to risk, whereas USOPC might have had basketball at a lower risk, NCAA might have had it at a lower risk, and it's actually could be shifting at this point based on the more we learn about COVID, contact, and such. So really, we looked at other significant sport organizations, research organizations, and our Sports Med Advisory Committee looked at tiering those sports with regard to proximity and the likelihood that kids would be breath to breath, if you will. We're learning now that surface contact isn't as much of a concern as it used to be back in March and April. And we have many more mitigation measures to keep equipment clean. It's really the breath to breath thing. And so contact with the body, proximity of the body. So we're really trying to work in alignment with other organizations and what they've considered to be low, medium, and high risk. And I hope that helps.
Very good. Regarding football, if football does return in the fall on time, what does it look like and what should it look like?
I think it looks like absolute phasing in. I think it looks like an extreme degree of pre-participation, physical, and questioning. The questioning, again, regarding potential COVID in the background, and the physical conditioning, because a lot of our kids, and the Wisconsin study indicates this as well, our kids have not been as physically active as they typically would be in the month of May, and that was the month they primarily focused on. We're really concerned about heat acclimatization, about physical conditioning, looking at what it's like to come back preseason football, and really getting a good handle on the level of physical conditioning and potential COVID exposure or even testing. When kids do come back to football, obviously there's conditioning, There's then moving into pads, and then moving into, and there's certain kinds of drills that happen along the way. So as kids work back into phasing in, we're recommending a sort of a pod approach, smaller groups of the same kids early on in the return. They share the equipment as they will in their drills. They don't necessarily interact with all 70 in the first phase. We're not obviously in contact. Even if we're not in pads, we're not in proximity if we can help it. As we move into phase 2, we're looking at now maybe greater numbers of kids are engaging in drills. Maybe there is contact sharing with dummies. Maybe there is a little bit more proximity, light body to body, as we go through drills. Phase 3 obviously would be within the team, not even talking about scrimmages yet, within the team. Now we're probably a month in. Are we scrimmaging within the team? Are we full field? Are we all of our drills, all of our game situations, all of our X's and O's, and mind you, at the end of every day, all along, phase 1 through 3, equipment, weight room, anything that's being shared is fully sanitized, no locker rooms, no shared hydration stations until phase 3. So it's really looking at trying to keep equipment and shared things to a minimum until you're really in phase 3. Thorough cleansing and monitoring your kids constantly with an emergency action plan in case there is. If there's one case, we've got a concern.
Very good. I think this will be our last question. We'll try to get to all the rest of them in the chat with respond to you personally, but one more here. College and pro leagues have many more resources than high schools. We're seeing a lot of them struggle to get things going. How realistic that high schools can safely resume activities without those same type of resources?
Well, this is a great question. So for example, we have a small Division I league here in central Indiana that almost half of their revenue comes from March Madness. So when the NCAA lost $700 million on March Madness alone, some of that money being dispersed to collegiate conferences, our smaller conferences at the collegiate level really are looking at struggle. This is probably the one and only time that I will say this is a good thing that such a small portion of a school district budget is allocated for athletics and activities, performing arts activities. It's usually between 1.5% and 3% of the overall school district budget. 80 to 85% roughly of the school district budget is staff, salaries, and benefits. It's just the way it is. And then you have to get into other things that are operational, maybe 0.5% to 1% professional development. Somewhere in there is co-curricular. So I would say very clearly to school districts, if you have financial challenges, and they do, with federal funding, with local funding, I don't think it's appropriate to look at co-curricular opportunities like sports and performing arts as a place to go to recoup lost funding. The damage to the school culture, the damage to the growth and development of our kids and to the community is not worth it. So I don't think our school districts, they're not going to be in a financial challenging situation equal to what a university or college might feel relative to loss of sport percentage-wise. But certainly from a cultural perspective, I would not equate the loss of dollars from sport to the reason why we cut the sport altogether or performing arts. The damage is just too great. And it's not a good place to try to recoup lost district funding.
Thank you very much, Karissa. We greatly appreciate this opportunity that we've had to answer all these questions and to visit these important subjects as schools look to reopen activities this fall. And we hope that you're able to, and we will continue to have information available on our website as these decisions are made regularly. We have our contact information here. If you would like a recording of this session, please drop us an email. We'll be glad to get that out to you. And we will continue to, on a regular basis, provide information about what's going on in high school sports and activity programs across the country. We thank you much for your attendance today, and we wish you all a good day, and we'll keep in touch. Thank you very much for your attendance.